Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. Today I would like to talk about the OM605 and OM606 engines, and even though I changed my race car to petrol now, I would like to summarize the topic about OM605, OM606 tuning for me personally and also for this channel in some kind of video series. So this is the first part of a OM606, OM605 tuning guide video series. And I would like to categorize those videos. I'm thinking about doing 3 of those and would like to categorize them by performance level. So this video will be about the first performance stage, let's say, low performance stage around 250 horses on the 605 and 300 horses on the 606. And I would like to start with some general information, some general repair work before starting the engine tuning, and then give you more insight on what I would do personally to achieve this power level. But before we get started, I think it's important to say that this is just my personal opinion on tuning these engines. Those are informations I collected during the years racing this engine on the racetrack and modifying it a lot. And of course there are many opinions out there how to tune these engines, many concepts of tuning these engines. Some people will tell you to just put a big turbo on, a big pump, and then make 600 horses without modifying a lot. And this can work. Sometimes it depends on the use. It can last for 10 minutes, maybe a year, but it can also destroy the engine and bend rods and whatnot. So this is not my concept of tuning these engines. I always want to make sure that everything is modified nicely and consistent so the power level can be achieved and can last for a long time, even when the engine is tracked hard, for example. That's what I wanted to say before we start, because many opinions means there will be a lot going on in the comments maybe. People saying just do it like this, do it like that, and this is wrong, this is right. Just want to make sure you know this is just my opinion. But after that, now I think we can start, and I will give you a view on the engine and talk a little bit about the repair work you should do. So it doesn't matter if you have the engine from a junkyard separately, like I have it here, or you just bought a car with this engine in and want to start getting some power. There's always some basic maintenance and repair work you can do to these engines before starting to modify for higher power. And this is not just the standard maintenance work like oil and filter exchange, but it very much depends on the performance level you want to achieve, because the higher the performance level, the deeper you have to dive into the engine and therefore can reach more parts which could be worth it to exchange. And so first of all, you need to make sure you are clear about the performance level. And for this video, like I said before, we want to talk about a low performance level like 250 to 300 horses on the OM605, which equals 300 to 360 horses on the OM606. And this could be a very nice daily build, so you don't have a big turbo lag, you can use it daily and you don't need to modify much. So this is the cheapest build, the easiest to achieve build, and also a very nice thing for daily use. I just disassembled the top cover and the intake manifold to have a better view. And I just noticed I have a hard time not making the video too chaotic, because there are a lot of areas you need to work on and it's hard to describe like in an ordered manner. But let's talk about the pump first maybe. The first question you need to answer is, do I have to disassemble the pump? For power goal, let's say 250 horses, some people could argue that 6mm elements like we have it here in the electronic injection pump could be enough, so they could deliver enough fuel for this power goal. So that it's up to you. You could just leave the pump like it is, buy, for example, an electronic control unit from Baldur, the DSL1, many of you know this, and then squeeze every possible amount out of this pump. But this is not my kind of building, like I told before, because with 6mm elements, the injection time gets very long when you want to inject that much fuel, and this is thermically disadvantageous for this engine, because when the injection time gets long, the piston stroke is actually down below while the pump or the injector is still injecting fuel, and this is not converted to mechanical power but only for heat. And this is something I don't want to have. So my concept for tuning, even at this power level, is to take bigger elements and get the injection time like in a nice range which is close to original. And therefore I would exchange the elements and I would have to disassemble the pump. So this would be the first thing we do. We would disassemble the pump, disassemble the lines, disassemble the injectors also, because I would always advise to get them overhauled, renewed, because if you don't know the history of this engine, the spray pattern of these injectors could be totally off, or a nozzle element in these injectors took a lot of heat and therefore doesn't work like it should anymore. And this need to be checked and renewed. And also for this power goal, I would adjust the opening pressure of the injectors to a higher grade. So for example, 145 bars, which helps with the spray pattern of more fuel. And so pump away, injector lines, injectors, and then also we would disassemble the valve cover and all these rubber and plastic parts. And these are the first parts which will maybe break because they get very brittle over time. So these are parts you should always renew when you start building these engines. So this rubber part, this maybe, you can also buy these plastic tubes new at Mercedes, and also this rubber part here, which will most probably break. And then I would advise you to buy a sealing kit for the cylinder head and the valve cover from a brand like Victor Reins or L-Ring, and replace everything on your way while diving deeper into the engine. So of course the valve cover seal here, and also the seals here for the valve cover, which are underneath here. And also below the valve cover there are these parts here around the injectors, and when you have the valve cover disassembled, they are easy to pull out and renew this sealing ring. So this is something you can do quite easily. And then also when we disassemble the injectors, of course those tubes we took off, and these should be renewed. And for those I would very much advise to buy original Mercedes tubes, because the ones you get on the market are normally a different material. So from original, this is FKM, so a brand name is Vuitton, a very nice and very high grade rubber, and they stick to the injectors very well. And the material you get on the free market is normally like NBR. It's also a good rubber, but not the same grade like this one, and they tend to fall off when, for example, you exchange the fuel pump to a high pressure pump, and you get some fuel pressure also on these lines, because the return line is kind of restricting the flow. So in the return line there usually also builds up pressure, which goes also on these lines. And if you don't have a high quality line here, they tend to pop off, and then you flood your whole valve cover with fuel, which can be very dangerous. And therefore this is a point to focus on. Get a high grade hose for this purpose. And also these clips, you should always make sure that you have all of these clips assembled. The engine will work without them, there's no doubt, of course, but for longer use, if you have the vibrations in the lines and they aren't supported here on those places, they could break, and this would be also not very nice while driving. Imagine the whole engine bay gets flooded with diesel. Could be also dangerous when something comes on the exhaust manifold, starts burning. So these are always very important measures. Then while the pump is away, of course, when we assemble it again, we need a new O-ring here for the diesel pump. We have access to a lot of other stuff like the glow plugs. I would also advise to renew the glow plugs, which can be a tricky task because some of you might have heard that they tend to stick and you can break them off when using too much force. The best thing actually would be to bring the engine to operating temperature, and shortly after that try to remove the glow plugs because the heat helps with disassembly. But this is something I would definitely do to have a nice start up. There's nothing much more annoying than just having 2 or 3 glow plugs work and always have the same trouble when starting the engine. And when you assemble the glow plugs, I would always advise to use some kind of copper paste or ceramic grease paste. Put it on the whole shaft of the glow plug, not the tip, but only the shaft and the thread, and then screw it in and not over tighten it. So this just on the side. And when we have this engine separately, like we have it here, I would also advise to disassemble the oil filter housing, because this can be an area where you have leakage, oil leakage. And when the engine is in the engine bay, this can be very hard to do. So I would advise, if you have the engine laying around like here, disassemble the oil filter housing, get a new seal for this area, screw it back on. And of course, while you do this, you should also renew the sealing rings here between this heat exchanger and the oil filter housing. There are 2 sealing rings, and also the sealing rings from this heat exchanger to the cylinder head and the block. And depending on your fuel concept, if you want to keep the original fuel lines, you will have to replace all those O-rings, because after years of use they tend to take air inside, so you have air in your fuel lines, which doesn't help with the performance. So I actually have a O-ring kit for these areas here all around. You don't see all the fuel lines now because they're partly disassembled, but all the lines which gets plugged in here and there and below, they have O-rings, and I have a full O-ring kit in my online shop. So this is always what you should do. And also the pre-filter here, you should exchange this. You can take out the screw, unplug the line from there, and then take out the pre-filter and renew it. It doesn't cost much. It's a very cheap part to exchange, and always good to do. And also this O-ring here on the front. Of course, the belt tensioner is always a topic. So as you see here already, this is running not very nice. I would exchange this, I would exchange the arm, I would exchange the pin here, because they're sometimes worn out and you get some play here, and that's what you hear. You hear some kind of knocking when the engine is running, and also the damper element. That's what I would renew always. Other than that, of course, everything you disassemble, you have to get a new seal. So also for the vacuum pump, I would take a new seal. But the rest actually for this power level, of course, on this side, it then mainly depends on our turbo setup, but most probably I would disassemble the exhaust manifold, get it ported a little bit, and then of course we need a new sealing here. I just forgot the water pump because it is not assembled here, but of course while you do all the maintenance work I just told you before, you should also exchange and renew the water pump, and while doing this also renew the seals, so the seal here. And for the build I would suggest you should also disassemble this part here from the engine block, and therefore you can renew also this seal. This was all just preparation, the standard basic repair and maintenance work. Let's talk about the modification to achieve our power goal. So as I told you before, me personally, I would suggest to get bigger pump elements also for this low power level. And for this power level, I would suggest 7mm or 7.5mm elements. You can buy, for example, an EDC pump from Myne OE. They developed their own 7mm pumps, or also the classic diesel making 7.5mm elements would suit this power level very well. And so this is the first thing. Then, as I told you, the injectors, after overhauling them and adjusting them to a higher pressure, I would also use different heat shields. So here you see the 3 types of heat shields. Those ones, I think they got introduced in old engines like OM616, OM617, and then these are some later versions, I think from OM603, OM602, OM601. And those were also used in the OM606 and OM605 engines. But there is an upgraded version available also in my online shop, which is this one. It is much thicker and has a smaller hole. And you see it gets smaller with the generations, because you need to protect the nozzle from the heat. When this sits like this, the smaller hole will protect better from the heat influence on the nozzle element, which is good, especially on high power levels. And that's what I would always recommend, to use these upgraded heat shields to prevent the nozzles from damage. So this is the fuel side actually. Pump with bigger elements, renewed injectors with a better heat shield, and also then you have to think about the fuel to the pump. So will you upgrade to an electrical fuel pump like I did, or will you stay with the original system, which also works nice for this power level? So you have the lift pump here, which takes the fuel from the tank and brings it with a higher pressure to the fuel, to the injection pump. This is up to you, what you prefer. And for the turbo side, as I told you already, for the power level we want to achieve, we can easily use the original manifold. It will give enough flow to achieve that. But me personally, while I have this disassembled and on my workbench, I would always port it a little bit, so make the hole to the turbocharger bigger, like make the flow a little bit better and match it to a bigger turbo exhaust housing. My setup looked like this. So I took a stainless steel plate like this one, which I will also sell in the online shop. And then I took a modern turbocharger from Garrett, and this one had a TL housing, and I welded this housing, which is also stainless steel, to this plate, so it was a direct fit on the original manifold, and the turbocharger sits quite nicely, very compact on the same area. And yeah, that's what I would suggest. I would also suggest to always get a Generation 2 Garrett turbocharger or the most modern G line. So a G25 550, for example, which would be good for this power range, or a GTX 2867, for example, but always Generation 2. Or even a slightly bigger one would be possible, but this would make a nice turbocharger for that power level. And because the ball bearing turbochargers always have water cooling, that's the reason for the modification of the water pump housing. As I did it on my daily, I put a hole here in this area, which usually is not drilled through. Get a thread inside, 14 times 1.5 thread size, and then you can take like a banyo or dash system connector and bring the water to the turbocharger, and from the turbocharger into the block here on this plug. That's what I did, and it works very nice for like 40,000 kilometers I'm driving my setup now. Never had problems with the temperatures, and the turbocharger is still working like on the first day. So this is the turbo side, and of course you need to choose, will I have an internal wastegate or external? External wastegate could be put here. You need to make an adapter to fit here, but this can be done. Or you can use an internal wastegate, or what I did, I didn't use any wastegate at all, but this only works with the electronic fuel pump, because then you can limit the fuel very specifically to the RPM, and this allows you to not over speed the turbocharger, even though you don't have a wastegate. But I would always recommend to have a wastegate because it's more safe. But that's something you need to take into account when using small modern turbochargers, to not overspeed them. That's why in my build I had a sensor for that, a speed sensor for the turbocharger, and I could adjust my map for the fuel according to the turbocharger speed, so to have no area where I overspeed it, but always be on the limit of the fuel I could put to the engine. And it worked very nicely. So I think this was basically all the information for the low power setup. I think I will end this part of the video series here before it gets too long. But I think the most important parts I was able to cover with this video. To summarize this again, for a power level of 250 horses, or on the OM606 300 horses. For the fuel system you should get an upgraded pump, 7 or 7.5 millimeter elements. Also renew the injectors, get some upgraded heat shields, renew every seal on your dive into the engine. Get, like, for example, a seal kit from Victorines or L-Ring for the cylinder head and valve cover, and renew everything you can. Also the belt tensioner. Get a nice and modern turbocharger in the right size. Put it on the original exhaust manifold. Port it a little bit and get like an adapter plate welded to the housing directly. Put the turbocharger on. Build the lines, build the cooling lines for the turbocharger. Therefore, drill a hole here, bring the line from the pump to the engine block through the turbocharger, of course. And that's mainly it. And then you will have a nice 250 to 300 horsepower build, which will be great for daily use and will work very nicely. Thank you for watching. I would appreciate very much if you like or leave a comment or subscribe to my channel to give it a little push. And see you in the next video.